There's Dave Parnas, ready with his slides for the presentation on software engineering. He's a professor emeritus of my institution, McMaster, as well as the University of Limerick in Ireland. His PhD is in electrical engineering, but he devoted his career to seeing how software development and engineering might interface with each other. And when I rewrote his bio to say that he was the father of software engineering, he objected mightily, although if you go to the web, you find him described that way in many places. He's really focused on why software often is not reliable and how we can move forward. His main renown is from having resigned from the Star Wars project because he didn't think the software that was being developed could possibly be trusted. Here's Dave Parnas, software engineering. So what we're going to do is he will make his presentation and we will have the extended discussion of it immediately following. Then we will switch to Larry Alford's presentation.
Okay, hi. I can start now. Is anybody hearing me?
Yes, it's working perfectly.
Okay. Well, hello to everybody. I'm, for many reasons, very sorry that I couldn't be there today. One of the most ironical reasons is that I realize that I'm about to try to explain to you why I think software and software engineering is in really bad shape, and yet I'm unable to deliver this talk to you without the use of a huge amount of software. Between you and me, there are many different programs written by people who never met each other, cooperating in order to make this possible. So somehow this is a self-contradictory talk, but I'll try to convince you of the truth anyway. So let me begin by giving you what I think this talk has, which is two bottom lines. And at the end of the talk, I'll try to tie the two together better. The first bottom line is that what we call software engineering is not yet an engineering profession, but it could be, it should be. And I'll try to explain what we have to do to make that possible. The second thing I want to talk about, and it is really connected, is I want to respond to a lot of hype that I've been hearing lately about something called artificial intelligence. And I want to explain why it is not a solution to the software problems that we have today. So one of the main theme of the talk is about long-term issues. What do we have to do to get better software and better software projects? And the other part is a sort of short-term reaction to current hype about the government and where the various governments that we share are investing our hard-earned money. So what do I think of as a person who's been a software professional most of my life? I think of bugs. I think of huge amounts of projects that are full of bugs. I'll talk a little more about that later. And they're never bugs that prevent the thing from working most of the time, but they cause it to fail occasionally. I'm thinking about long days, delays in completion, because every project that I know of has exceeded its estimated cost by huge amounts, and some have been complete failures, and all have been completed later than expected. And I reach from this exposure to software, and this is all over the world, not just in Ottawa, not just in Canada, not just in North America, but all over the world. My conclusion is that we are having software built by people that I think are really competent. And if I have to give a simple explanation, it's a line that one of my best friends once used in a talk. He said, "Here, you need a license to cut hair. but you don't need a license to build software that controls the safety of a nuclear plant. So we have, throughout our society, made things work better by making sure that people have the proper education, training to do their job properly, and that if they don't do their job properly, they'll lose their license to do that job. But in software, that simply isn't true. And I think that's at the heart of the problem. Now, most of the people in this audience, I believe, are not engineers. So I want to tell you a little bit about the engineering profession. Now, what many people don't realize is that engineering and science, although they're often used in a single phrase like that, we talk about engineering and science. I've known faculties of engineering and science. They're really very different. Engineering is what is called a self-regulating profession. That means it's like medicine or law. You need a license to call yourself an engineer. Now, professional societies are empowered by the law to enforce standards, to make sure that people who are licensed to be engineers really are qualified to be engineers. Now, in the other two areas that I mentioned, medicine and law, this obligation is respected. Just yesterday, the Ottawa Citizen had a headline on the front page that said, "Jail time sought for fake doctor." Story about a woman who has been performing medical acts without any medical training, and they want to put her in jail. In fact, she's already been told several times by the law to stop, and she continues. And nobody is really surprised by that. I think everybody is glad somebody is making sure that our doctors are qualified. But some things don't work the same way in engineering, and I want to talk about that a little bit. One big factor in engineering is something called the industrial exemption. For a while, the government was going to get rid of this, but it came back to life because this industrial exemption says you can be an engineer building safety critical things without a license if you work for a company. The company takes the responsibility, and so they don't need to hire engineers. Now, to me, this is like saying you can be a doctor and do surgery if you work for a hospital, right? I don't think we'd be very happy with that. But that to me is one major problem. We're going to see how that has an implication on what happens with software, because most software is built by companies. Second thing is the way we use the word engineer. Over and over again, I hear the verb used as the word used as a verb. Like I had a housekeeper for a while used to say, "Tonight I'm going to engineer you a really good dinner." All she really meant was make or build. There are many people all over this world who call themselves an engineer. I've had people who were trained in, let's say, modern languages who suddenly said, "But I decided to become an engineer," which meant they decided they could make more money writing programs. There's also many ways the word engineer is used. Like people say, "Yeah, engineers drive trains." They don't even have university educations, which may be a good thing. But finally, but licensing obligation is very hard to enforce because it's based on something called engineering principles. It says the practice of engineering is something that applies engineering principles, and that's not defined. And the whole thing is full of circular definitions. Finally, I think most of the public is unaware of the law and the problem. And I guess one last final, a lot of finalies today. There's something called demand-side legislation, which is supposed to say that you can't do certain things unless you have a license. Now, the demand-side legislation for engineering is basically civil engineering. There's a strong tradition that everybody that designs the bridge you drive over and the roads you drive on, the buildings that you walk next to, has a license to do that. And the law requires that. You won't get permission to build anything major unless you have it approved by a licensed engineer. But in the rest of our technological world, there is very little demand size legislation. A computer in front of me can be built by anybody. There's no law that says otherwise. Now, engineering works in Canada and Ontario because of a system of accreditation. It's been agreed by the universities, and it's only been violated once that I know of. They won't allow a program to be called engineering unless it has been approved by something called the Accreditation Board. And this Accreditation Board is a very active thing. There are visiting committees that come regularly to universities. They study detailed curriculum descriptions. They study detailed course descriptions. They actually read student work. I sometimes suspect they're the only ones who read that student work, certainly not the students. They interview students, administrators, faculty. They identify a list of deficiencies, and then the department gets an approval for its program for a limited time only. If a department has several different engineering programs, there are different committees, one for each one. When they get done, you are a graduate of an accredited program. You're still not an engineer. You have to get a license by taking 2 more examinations, one on more or less ethics and one on law. And people who don't have an accredited engineering degree, and they may have been educated outside of Canada, for example, or they may be self-educated, they can still get a license, but they have to take a lot more examinations. The program in the US is slightly different, depends more on examinations and less on accreditation, but the idea is the same. Nobody can call themselves an engineer. They have to be called an engineer by a legal body that is allowed to do that. Now, things went wrong with software, in my opinion, because it began as a do-it-yourself job done by scientists. The first programs that I was aware of were usually written by a single author who was the main user. Nobody was offering the service of creating software to the public. Nobody thought of it as a profession on its own. You could be a physicist who knew how to program, or you could be an engineer who knew how to program. You could be a doctor who programmed as a hobby. I've actually had my shoulder worked on by a doctor who programmed as a hobby, and I couldn't stand it because he kept thinking he knew all about software. Also, initially, nobody regarded software as a long-lived product because they were programs that were written depended on the machines, and the machines kept being replaced with entirely different machines. Today, this has changed because we've pretty much standardized the programming interface of the machines, and people move software from their old Mac to their new Mac or their old PC to their new PC. They don't think anything of it. Finally, the engineers weren't very interested. Back in the late 60s, there were 2 conferences on software engineering, and if you look at who attended, it was not attended by engineers. Most of the people were scientists or mathematicians who were major users of computers and had gotten into programming, but their education was elsewhere. And the one thing that they all agreed on was negative. They knew that what they were doing was not science. Science, the work of a scientist, was to add to the world's knowledge. They were building products that either they or other people used. Even the mathematicians could see that they weren't really doing mathematics. They weren't proving theorems, which is what they'd been taught to do. And finally, software wasn't seen as critical to the public. So the original tradition was that it was taught as a science. There was no accreditation, no core body of knowledge, and there were no entry barriers to the profession. I taught all kinds of industrial courses, and I asked people how they got into the industry. And it's through a philosophy degree or some other thing that doesn't pay very well. And they just taught themselves to program. So today I see a software field as very good source jobs. One of the things I've noticed is the best job creation program you can have is a really bad program. When you write a bad program, you create many jobs maintaining it and improving it. So the thing that strikes me is when I talk to younger, especially younger software developers, let's call them that, they see design and massive bugs as normal. And I'm talking about people who work for companies like Rogers or Bell or DEC. Well, not DEC is not there anymore. A lot of these companies aren't there anymore. Sometimes it's a good thing. And they really took it as normal that uh, that there were bugs. I had a friend who became chief of what was then a very major computer hardware company. He was in charge of their operating system. And he said that at any point in time, he had a list of known bugs and that usually numbered about 3,000. Now, this wasn't a product that wasn't delivered yet. This was a product that I was using and many other people were using. So somehow people regard program unreliability as sort of natural and they think it's inherent in software. And when you come up with something that doesn't work, you talk to a professional, the first thing they tell you is turn your computer off and start it up again. Maybe it'll go away. You've all done that, and you know it often does work. It's very interesting why it works, but essentially you lose a lot of the state that had the problem in it. Now we have examples that reach the headlines. If you lived in Ottawa, every day you read some article about the Phoenix Pay system. The previous government got the idea of replacing all the various pieces of software that were generating checks for civil service with a new one, and it still doesn't work. I think they have 40 or 50,000 outstanding cases today, months after they'd have it fixed, and that was months after they started using it. There's another project to consolidate all email systems. Some various departments had separate email systems, and they thought they should all have the same one. They've achieved in giving everybody a common domain name. But in fact, many people have lost access to their old emails because the hardest part of consolidating an email system is moving the old emails that are stored into the new system. In Ontario, we have the e-health system, which was a scandal a few years ago, and now nobody's talking about it. I see it once every year or two when I go to the Ottawa Heart Institute to have my pacemaker checked. And the first thing I notice is that I have to check in twice. I go to one place and check in, they have my appointment records, and then they phone upstairs and I go upstairs and I have to check in again. When I finish, they give me an appointment and they send a piece of paper downstairs to put that appointment in the record. Those two computers, one floor apart in one building, can't talk to each other. So they actually scribble on a piece of paper. I see them do it every time. And there's a problem that's much closer to my heart. I'm on my second pacemaker now. When I got the first one, I was actually stupid enough to ask for the manual. And reading it and talking to the people, I discovered that in fact it had a bug in it. The bug is what we call a requirements bug. I actually had the opportunity to visit the place where the pacemaker was designed and built. And I asked them, they weren't even aware of the thing that I was complaining about, which at that time was a real problem for me. And when I explained it to them, they said, well, there's no good reason for that. We'll fix that. And 13 years later, I got a new pacemaker. And I asked if that had been fixed. And the doctors told me, no, it's just like your old one. So that really bothers me. It really makes my heart skip a beat. So why is software engineering in such bad shape? I think it's very easy. No license is required. There's no agreement on what the accreditation system depends on having identified a core body of knowledge, something that all engineers in a particular discipline have to know. There's no agreement on that. It's still confused with computer science. I know people who regard software engineering as just a research field within computer science. Some think it's the same as computer science. Some think that computer science is part of software engineering. Some think that they're completely different things. That's where I am. And I see it as having a relation similar to physics and electrical engineering. Many people have forgotten this now, but when electrical engineering was added to the list of engineering disciplines, it was a latecomer compared to mechanical and civil engineering. The physics departments objected, saying, we can teach that. But it turns out that what you learn as a physicist and what you learn as an electrical engineer are quite different. And the reason is that physicists are scientists and they're taught to add to the world's knowledge, whereas software engineers or engineers of any kind are building things and they're taught to apply the world's knowledge. And I see the same thing as a difference between computer science and software engineering. And to me, one of the frustrating things is I think most of the people that study computer science don't intend to add to the world's knowledge. They want to build software that dentists will buy from them. And yet we tend to educate them as if they were going to be just like us, researchers and scientists. Now, when you look at the engineering field, you realize that the body of knowledge that we use in the accreditation process should be based on a list of required capabilities. What is it that a software engineer should know before they start to practice their profession? And here's a list. Now, you don't have time to read this list, and I don't have time to read it to you, but it's part of it's a basis of a paper that I recently published with a team of about 6 people from around the world. And it's an interesting thing is programming doesn't even appear on this list as such. There's a lot of things that you have to be able to do as a software engineer that have nothing to do with programming, and they're not all computer science. And it's another talk to explain this list. But it's an interesting thing about this list. I found it's not controversial. When I showed it to people who weren't involved in writing it, the most frequent response is, well, this is obviously true. And yet it is controversial because everybody agrees that these are the things that a software engineer needs to be able to do to be a competent practitioner, but they don't agree on how to do them. So, for example, I believe that the use of mathematics is an essential tool for all engineers, including software engineers. But many of the other people in the field, people who make much more money than I did, they believe that you can do it by having certain styles of meetings. And they taught at length about holding meetings to short periods, make sure that you can meet once a day, and things like that. I believe that the interfaces between people's work is very complex, very detailed, that in the software field, almost is a euphemism for wrong. If you say that the program's almost right, it really is having a polite way of saying that it's wrong. So I find that list is not controversial, but there's a lot of controversy about how it should be taught. And the other thing I find is it's not what's taught. A couple of years ago, was on a committee. In fact, the authors of that paper were a committee that investigated 12 or 13 different programs. I say 12 or 13 because there was a fight about how many different programs there were, but either 12 or 13. And what we found is that none of them were teaching those things. It's the main reason we wrote that paper. They were teaching science, parts of computer science, but they weren't teaching how to use it. They taught math. A lot of computer scientists are at least the intellectual descendants of mathematicians, but they didn't teach how to use it. They taught programming languages, but not when and how to use them. They even taught something called program verification, but they never were told to use it in their projects. All of them did projects as part of their education, and in none of them were they required to use program verification. Now, I contrast that to what I know about medicine, for example, because many of my family are doctors, and I see what their education was like. And they had a lot of lectures and they had a lot of opportunity to use what they heard in those lectures under supervision. And everything that they were taught was something they would use, and everything that they had to use was something that they were taught. And I don't think that's a property of the education that we have today. So this leads me to the first of my bottom lines, that what needs to be done to make software engineering like a real engineering profession is, first of all, we have to introduce licensing requirements. It should not be the case that anybody who can get a job can write software that controls a nuclear plant or an airplane and now a car, right? We need to look at the accreditation standards because there are some now by the Canadian Engineering Regulatory Associations, and I think they're way too weak. I think they need to be re-examined based on the required capabilities of the job. I think we need to upgrade all the educational programs, and I think we need to wait. I tried to build a software engineering program once. I consider that effort to be a failure, but the people working in it probably wouldn't agree. But what I found was the hardest part was that I couldn't find people who were prepared to teach. One of the things when you're an electrical engineer, if you have an electrical engineering program, you can find graduate electrical engineers who have been through the kind of education you want to give. But when you start a new engineering field, your source of teachers is very limited. So it will take time for these changes to happen. Now, last part of my talk is shorter and quicker, but I do want to talk about all the hype I've been hearing lately about artificial intelligence and that the implications that it will improve quality of software, that all kinds of things will become so good that they're going to put us out of work. The first thing I want to say is that this is not new to me. My very first year as a graduate student, and maybe even before that, I was able to take courses from the leaders and the founders of the artificial intelligence field. And the one thing I'm convinced of is that AI is a very promising field. And by that, I mean that they make lots of promises. They made promises in the 50s that they haven't kept today. I have detailed examples. We don't have time today. When I look at what they have accomplished, I find that it's all attributable to the fact that the hardware today is so much better than it was before. The methods that they're using are still essentially the same. The characteristics of these artificial intelligence methods is that they're what's called heuristics, rules of thumbs, and they are methods that almost always work. My opinion as an engineer is it's something that almost always works and the most dangerous product you can have because people learn to depend on it. And once it does fail, then suddenly they're not prepared to do without it. We've already been seeing that with stories about self-driving cars. Most of the time they work fine, but the driver is supposed to always be alert. And we've had people killed because they weren't ready to take over. Because when it works most of the time, you relax and you're not paying attention. And then suddenly you're in control of the car and you don't know what's going on. And this is a very dangerous way. The other thing I've been noticing over the 50 or 60 years that I've been hearing people use the word AI is that they make progress by changing the meaning of words. I remember when people began to talk about robots. Now, very few people know that the origin of that word is a Czech play by Čapek, which was called Rossum's Universal Robots. There's no known use of that word before, so it's a Czech word. And it was being, in the play, they were acted by human beings, and they were almost indistinguishable from human beings. They were really just like us. Today, I can buy a robot vacuum cleaner. It's a saucer that crawls around the room. It's a crawling saucer instead of a flying saucer. And they tell me it's a robot. They tell me that there's artificial intelligence in my washing machine, which leads me not to trust it. One of my favorite teachers once told me long ago that he considered artificial intelligence researchers to be illusionists. And I said, why? He said, well, what they create when they're successful is the illusion of intelligence. Now, one of the things we've seen over the years is that this is remarkably easy to do. First of all, there is no definition of artificial intelligence. And without a definition, it's very easy to say you have it and nobody can disprove it. So that's a very important tool. Then they talk about somebody named Alan Turing. Most of you will have seen him in the movies, or his, not him, but an actor playing him. Very brilliant guy. And they say that he devised a test for artificial intelligence that defines the field. It says it's an imitation game. And now every time I hear that, I wonder if the person who says that has actually read that paper. Turing did write a paper about artificial intelligence, but the very first thing he said in that paper is that the question, can machines think, is not a scientific question because we have no way to measure whether or not somebody is thinking. Many, many years ago, the late Joseph Weizenbaum, one of the earliest of computer scientists, somebody who was in the field when I was still a student, he built a program called ELIZA. Now, ELIZA was so good at creating the illusion of intelligence that people consulted it as a therapist. He basically modeled it on a field of psychotherapy called Rogeri, I believe. And even his secretary, who knew what was in it, would sit there on her lunch hour and talk to it about her problems. And people today still believe that Joseph Weizenbaum was trying to build a machine that passed Turing's test. But he made it very clear, if you talk to him, that he was trying to show that Turing's test wasn't a test for intelligence. And if you read Turing's paper, which I don't consider very well written, if you read it carefully, you'll see that Turing would agree with him, that he was trying to use this test as an illustration of what would be a scientific question, and that he considered the question, can machines think, defined and unscientific. Another person who's nowhere near as well known is a fellow named Robert Duchak, who died very young. And he built a simple machine that could build everybody among the graduate students, faculty in the department where I was working, could beat everybody at pattern matching. And when you looked at how it worked, it had no intelligence at all. Same thing was true about ELIZA. Neural nets, it's well known from computer science theory, have no special capabilities. Learning is a deceptive word for collecting and using data. And it has many inherent faults. So my advice to people is that when somebody starts telling you that they're building or using AI, you have to question them. You have to find out what it really is, because sometimes it might really be good, but you have to be sure, because it's an undefined term, and it could be a very sound program, or it could be a very unreliable program, and you can't use that term. In fact, when somebody uses that term, I'd wonder if they are scientists at all. So my real bottom line is that today software is too important. Without software, I couldn't even talk to you. More than that, we couldn't drive our modern cars. It's too important to be left to amateurs. It shouldn't be the work of people who are illusionists. It shouldn't be built without the application of mathematics. That's the secret of success of engineering. And it shouldn't be built by those who use terms that they can't define. That's not the mark of an engineer or a scientist. The bottom line is that computers controlled by software are not living things. They're machines, they're subject to physical laws, and they can be mathematically analyzed. And software has to be written by people who know how to do that. So finally, Daphne, done. So we're time for questions.
Thank you, Dave. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but not too well.
Okay. We're going to take 3 minutes for questions and discussions with Dave, and then we're going to get off of Skype. So if you have something you want to ask him, now is your chance. It will not come later. Charlie, could you run the microphone, please?
While I'm moving this, I'll ask a question. If intelligence is going to be real, wouldn't it make an awful lot of mistakes? No, didn't come through. Okay.
Okay, Dave, the question was, if intelligence is going to be real, like human intelligence, would it not have to make a lot of mistakes?
In fact, that was one of the early definitions used for artificial intelligence. There's a thesis written at Carnegie Mellon that said it was based on the idea of heuristic program, and a heuristic was a rule of thumb that didn't always work. And my conclusion then, as an engineer, was that every time I wrote a program, I could either debug it or call it AI. I couldn't see that as a feature. And that's the reason I don't think AI is a solution to anything.
Yes, I have a comment and question here. I agree with you that mathematics is critical to sophisticated AI, but in fact, people like Jeff Hinton here at the University of Toronto have been using that. They have produced poetry translation programs that are essentially indistinguishable from human poetry translation. And finally, the Go program that has now beat all human champions, or the top human champion, forgive me, in fact uses heuristic approaches to learning that are modeled on humans, and it does better than humans. So I'd like your comments on those. I agree that there's been a lot of junk in AI over the years, but I think some of the deep learning stuff is going way beyond what you're caricaturing.
I did hear the question. So I did hear it. I did hear it. Yeah, so we don't have to spend time repeating it. The thing is, I don't want to spend my time on one person's work, at least not over Skype with a big audience that I can't even see. It might even include that person for all I know. But, and I don't think one person's work is important, but I don't think that people have shown, the successes people show with AI are things that where the correctness doesn't matter very much. There's been a lot of bad translations of poems. It's not hard to do them better. And when you look at them, then it becomes a matter of taste, whether it's good or not. That's very different from controlling a car or a nuclear plant or an airplane. And learning, to me, as I said on the slides but didn't have time to say, is just a question of collecting data and trying to assume that the future can be predicted by the past. Every time you buy a financial investment, one of the things they tell you is that past performance is no guarantee of future performance. And what I expect from an engineered product is that there is some guarantee about what it'll do and what it won't do. And I don't particularly think that learning is a good way to achieve that.
Regarding your analogy with medicine, we actually don't want our surgeons to be creative. In fact, they only do procedures that are standards in the field. On the other hand, all the software writers, all the programmers I've known are highly individualistic, creative people. And they, like writers and artists of all kinds, may not take kindly to being forced into training regimes and regulations. So what do you think about the personalities of programmers? Will they actually buy into this?
programmers are like all other people, their personalities vary a great deal. I don't think that's the real issue. I want people to be creative too. I always enjoyed my creative students much more than the other ones. But the thing is that it's like the current buzzword about innovation. People keep throwing that word around. They don't realize that there's a very thin line between being innovative, being creative, and being naive. The thing is, a great many innovations don't work because people didn't know the fundamentals. So what happens in medicine is that even the most creative surgeons, they know the old ways, they understand why they work, why they don't, when they don't work. They knowing those fundamentals allows them to innovate. And what bothers me is that in the software field, most people don't know the fundamentals.
Dave, thank you so much for going to the effort of doing this over Skype. I know you're in great pain. We really appreciate it. And if you were here, I would be handing you this guide that says University of Toronto. And inside is a book by Ursula Franklin called The Real World of Technology. It's a CBC Massey Lectures book, and we'll mail it to you. Thank you again.
Don't use email.
Bye. Sorry. Well done. Just a minute. We're putting that. I'm getting Larry's slides up before I introduce him. Come on. Close. Okay. Here we are. It's my great pleasure to introduce Larry Alford. He's the Chief Librarian of the University of Toronto Library and had previous library experience at Temple University and the University of North Carolina. In addition to the credentials written on the program, I didn't have time to include that he also is very generous in what I'll call community service. He's active in the American Library Association, the Association of Research Libraries, the Canadian Association of Research Libraries. He's been on the board of directors of those organizations, president very recently, and there are a number of other things on his CV that I could tell you about, but instead, I'd like him to talk about the future of the library, and he has chosen to figure out 5 things the library needs to do in the next 3 years.
Thank you. My voice tends to drop, so if you can't hear me, just let me know. Wave your hands, wave or something. So it's been a fascinating morning. I feel privileged to have been here to listen to these really interesting and fascinating presentations, and now I'm a little worried about talking about library priorities after all of these really interesting and exciting conversations. But actually, a lot of the priorities at the libraries come out of the things that you've heard about this morning. And Daphne, where's the clicker? Is that the clicker? Yeah, I got it. Just before I go off this slide, this is an iconic picture, as I'm sure many of you know, of the sakura trees outside of Robarts Library. I keep being asked about these trees, so I'm just going to say up front, we are going to build, hopefully build a new building in part of this space, but the trees are going to be protected, and they will actually thrive better than they are now. And I've learned more about sakura trees than I thought there was to know in the last 2 years. So there's been a lot of talk today about disruption, the disruptive changes that have been caused by technology, and I want to just spend a few minutes this morning talking to you about some of the priorities for the University of Toronto. They're often driven by these disruptive changes in some ways, and where I believe we and research libraries in general are going over the next few years. I chose 5 priorities that I believe are critical, but in doing that I realized I left out many, many other initiatives, including one, rethinking the library as a place, which I just alluded to. For the U of T, that means a 1,200 seat addition to the Robarts Library on the Huron Street side over the loading dock. It means many of you have probably seen the recladding of the Fisher Library, the sort of green, weird foam stuff that's on there, which will be covered up and it'll look like it always looked, but to really create state-of-the-art environmental conditions in that building. I've also learned a lot more about concrete aggregate than I thought I'd ever need to know. Building visualization spaces and maker spaces in the libraries, rethinking our engineering library to really transform it into a collaborative space for students, and many other things. And these spaces matter deeply to the students. I was honored to be asked to speak to you all. Some of you may have been there in February of 2015, I think it was, about the libraries. So I apologize if some of this seems familiar to you from that talk. But what I would say is research libraries are undergoing radical changes because of many of the disruptive technologies we've talked about today. But even so, many of the underlying principles that inform research library services and collections remain much the same. I'm actually astounded, however, at how different libraries are from 10 years ago and really different from when I started working in a research library in 1978, when part of my job was to actually work in card catalogs. I mentioned the word card catalog to anybody under 40 and they have no idea what I'm even talking about. Literally, they don't. They've never seen one. So the items I wanted to talk quickly about today are building collections in a digital world, digitization of our cultural and historical heritage, research data management in an open science and open data world, including addressing the challenges of digital preservation, of digitized and born digital materials, supporting new forms of scholarship, so scholarship enabled by actually our digital collections, and teaching information or digital literacy skills in a world we've talked about this morning, fake news and information overload. I could probably spend an hour on each of these topics, so I'm just going to be able to hit the surface very quickly. I just want to quickly say something. Many of you know about the U of T libraries, which rank 4th in North America. But sometimes you read in the newspapers or on the internet that libraries are going away. So I like to just say quickly, there are still 44 libraries at the U of T with 14 million volumes, 30,000 linear meters of archival materials, and we add to those probably 1,000 linear meters a year, millions of e-resources, 500 servers, and over 1,000, actually closer to 1,500 now, desktop computers that we support, petabyte and a half of data, 110,000 printed books added each year. 18,000 people use Robarts Library on a heavy day in the fall and spring. There's still 1.8 million circulations of print books and over 30 million downloads from our electronic collections, 1 million views of our online research guides a year, 2,000 instructional sessions taught by librarians. So I think the people that write those articles, the fake news articles about libraries, actually haven't been in a library in a long, long time. Libraries have always been about collections. And I think the first priority for research libraries, and the first one I'm talking about, is the need to continue to build collections for users today and in the future. So collection building in the digital age is actually quite different, and those differences have to be acknowledged and addressed. But the principles actually have not changed. We acquire and preserve the record of human knowledge and achievement needed by our scholars, and we preserve it for future scholars. And I'm often fond of saying it is both for today's students and faculty, but also people that have not been born yet, who will be using the collections, digital and print, that we are acquiring. It's important, an important part of what we do is also to collect rare and unique research materials for researchers now and in the future, and that's both print and digital. I am actually delighted today to share with you, before a public announcement, there's not been an announcement yet, but it's one of our most recent major acquisitions for the Fisher Library, which I like to call Canada's rare book library. I think it literally is Canada's rare book library. It's a late 14th century manuscript of the Roman de la Rose. For those of you who don't know, it was the most popular epic poem in the 14th and 15th centuries in France. This copy is a manuscript from about 1390, we believe with a 16th century binding. And as an aside, we're also going to announce a major addition to our world-class Darwin collection. It is arguably one of the 3 best Darwin collections in the world. We're adding a major addition to it that's a gift that will actually, we believe, make it the largest collection on evolutionary biology in the world. So we actually do still buy print books. But over 70% of our $30 million annual collections budget is actually spent on acquisition of electronic information, books, journals, archives, and data. Lots of statistical data. We actually recently acquired as a gift much of the Ipsos global survey data that will be used by faculty and graduate students for years and years to come. As you know, technology is changing the nature of the content, and new formats and contents are continually emerging to meet the needs of scholars now and in the future. We're acquiring things like streaming media, both visual and audio, and we're trying to preserve those. I'll talk about the preservation in a minute, but before I do that, I'd say electronic collections have unique issues, legal issues, licensing issues. In the print world, we clearly owned an item, and it was subject to use under fair dealing in Canada, fair use in the United States, under the copyright laws. There were no issues about that. But in the electronic world, those rights were often controlled and circumscribed, in some cases greatly limited by licenses. We have at the U of T between 600 and 700 different licenses for electronic information. We spend more than $22 million a year on those licenses. So those are annual subscriptions to information. We make every effort to own that information, but in some cases we actually don't own it. And lots of time negotiating those licenses, advising staff on users, staff and users on their rights in any particular license. So librarians have actually become contract experts and expert negotiators. Most of the record of human achievement and knowledge has been preserved in libraries over the centuries. Publishers usually didn't have access to their print archive when they began to digitize their back files. Most of the back digitization that you see from publishers actually came out of libraries. Companies get sold, they go out of business. Even the largest companies go out of business. So one of the real concerns of the modern era is how do we ensure that the research record, which is increasingly in electronic form, is preserved along with all the born digital records from sources documenting administrative decisions such as email, or social media that documents and is also the catalyst for social movements. Another question is, as I said, will the big publishers from whom we license much of the scholarly record today still exist in 50 years? So to ensure that the information will exist, we've built at the U of T a trusted repository that is also used by all the universities in Ontario, and we're talking about extending it to all of Canada to house this research data, the research record, with sophisticated tools, technology tools to ensure long-term preservation, just as we've done with books over the last centuries. Most scholars and patients not affiliated with a major university have no access to the research record, despite the belief that everything is on the web. So we actually at U of T spend $4.3 million Canadian each year to license just the 1,900 journals published by Elsevier, which is the largest scientific engineering medical publisher in the world. It's a Dutch company. Taxpayers and universities pay for that research. And this is true in the US, Canada, and Europe. We basically give it away to highly profitable companies such as Elsevier, and then we buy it back at, in our case, $4.3 million for university scholars to use the material. But most people in the world and in Canada have no access to that material because they're not affiliated with a university that can afford to license it. And that includes Canadians looking for the latest research on their own or a family member's health problem. We recognize that for scholars, the current research ecosystem rewards publication in these journals. I could never tell somebody who has a chance to publish in Nature that she shouldn't publish in Nature despite the enormous amount of money we spend to license Nature, because that would make her career. But the question is, how do we then make sure that research is open to everybody who may need it and to the taxpayers who actually have paid for it? How we navigate this complicated scholarly publishing environment while maintaining a system that works for scholars but is also viable economically for everyone to make the research record open is one of the great challenges, I think, of librarians and scholars in universities today. We grow our electronic collections through digitization of our print collections in part. This is a continuing priority for research libraries, and my second priority I wanted to talk about. As we approach 2020, we've done much at the U of T. We've digitized more than 450,000 books, but much, frankly, remains to be done. Let me talk just quickly about why we digitize. Without doubt, researchers want and need access to digital material whenever possible. The convenience is important. Our usage data shows that digitization greatly increases the use of our collections, but the powerful research tools and the ability to use digital information in different ways are also very important, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. I often ask, would the scholar prefer print over digital if she could get the material in digital format? And I think the answer is usually, although not always, she would prefer it in digital format. We digitize where and when possible, consistent with copyright law, and make that material easily available to scholars around the world for learning and research. That increases access, preserves the original, and also enables new forms of scholarship. Digitization allows thousands of uses, not just a few. Those uses open up worlds of knowledge and enable scholars to build on the work of others to advance humankind. For example, this beautiful, actually that's not it. This beautiful watercolor painting has been digitized for the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library and made available for downloading and viewing on our Flickr site, where it's been viewed now more than 1,300 times in just a few months. When you would usually need to make a trip to the Fisher Library, you'd have to make an appointment in advance to actually get them to retrieve this and then use it in a reading room under supervision. And in fact, this was just recently featured in a CBC News story. So, as I said, not everybody is fortunate enough to live in large urban centers such as Toronto with its incredible resources such as the Fisher Library, and that's why we digitize. Last night we had an event in the Fisher Library to celebrate in part our acquisition of the General James Wolfe archives a couple of years ago, celebrating a donor who helped us bring that material back to Canada. This is a part of our Confederation events, but also talking to an author who had used those archives, or who has used those archives to write a novel about General Wolfe that, from what she was saying, sounds like a really fascinating novel. I'm very proud that we were able to bring the Wolfe material back to Canada from England and to preserve them here, and they will be here 2 centuries from now, I'm absolutely certain. I just want to quickly say again about access. This is an old slide. It's actually from some data from 2009. But almost every study shows that when you digitize something, use goes from a few uses. In this case, it was 300 times more frequently used certain books over 3 years than their print counterparts had ever been borrowed. And for the most popular digital titles, the ratio was far, far higher. So it is really about the access that digitization has provided literally around the world to material that many people could have never seen. We also are working on media digitization and preservation. We have huge media collections, as many of you know, the largest media collections in Canada that need to be digitized urgently because the media that they're on is literally rotting away. We estimate at the current rate of digitization, we have about a 2,000-year backlog of these materials, which probably have a lifespan of about 25 more years in some cases. Many of them are obsolete forms. Our staff scour the internet, scour eBay for equipment to be able to read this material, but I particularly want to talk about what's on the screen. So the long-term preservation for these materials is a complex and expensive challenge, and it's a responsibility to the future that we're required to meet for the future. So recently a film on the Library of Congress's Lost U.S. Silent Feature Films list, there are a couple of thousand, I believe, films on that list, was rediscovered in our collections thanks to the U of T libraries and to a donor. Media archivists in our Media Commons discovered the film in a box of donations. Since then, it's been restored, digitized to make it available to scholars and film buffs around the world. So this was literally a film that has not been seen in 75 years, I guess. It was actually done in 1924. At the end of March, we actually hosted a screening of this film accompanied by a live pianist who was knowledgeable about, who was an expert actually on music, on movie music from the silent era, so he played as the film was being shown. It's one of the ways that the library is working to preserve and make available our cultural heritage. And actually, you may have seen in the last day or so, there's been a number of stories on CBC and in some of the newspapers and other media about the rediscovery of this film in our collection. But I think it's an outstanding example of actually the value that libraries bring to preserving and making accessible the cultural heritage. The third priority I want to talk about quickly is research data management. The U of T has a collection on insulin. It's a great example, I think, of research data management, even though it's from the 1920s. It's a culturally significant collection that was inscribed on the UNESCO Memory of the World collection, so it's one of 3 or 4 Memory of the World collections in Canada. We were able to create the collection because we hold the paper archival records, including the lab books that record the seminal discovery. The digital collections includes all the lab books, the patient records, photographs, published works, even early insulin vials, and the Nobel Prize is actually in Fisher that was won for this work. My question is, will our Cultural Heritage Institution hold the digital record that documents the next Nobel Prize winning discovery from our universities? And I think without a significant coordinated effort in the research data management realm, working with researchers, working with funding agencies, it is likely that we will not. I'm sure many of you know about many of your researchers, and you know about the vast amount of work and the data produced in the research process. I think, and I think this is borne out by the Insulin collection, that the library is the natural place to house and preserve this researcher-created data for the future. We must not only preserve research data, but also work with faculty in order to ensure its use and reuse across disciplines, across times, across geographies. At the same time, we have to navigate the thorny issues of intellectual privacy, of intellectual property, of copyright, of research integrity, and of privacy. And those can be some very difficult issues. To that end, we're developing policies to help guide digital preservation activities across the University of Toronto libraries, and to provide guidance on the broad range of preservation activities of this kind of data that we're engaged in, given the diverse nature of these collections. We have a major project underway we're calling Project Canopus, and I can explain the origin of that term later, but it's a project underway to support research data management. It is likely that the Tri-Councils next fall will mandate some kind of formal research data preservation plan for taxpayer-funded research, building all the privacy structure and intellectual property structures around it, but to ultimately allow the reuse and replication of that research data. So Project Canopus will allow us to ingest data, reformat it for preservation and reuse, house the data within a structure that controls access under policies that protect privacy and intellectual property, make the data discoverable, which is important, and allow ultimately replication and reuse of that data. All of that requires infrastructure. This is a picture from our data center where there are more than 500 servers, virtualized and automated, 1.5 petabytes of data data storage, enterprise-level backup, disaster recovery systems, 20 gigabit connection to the campus backbone. This investment in preservation infrastructure makes it possible for us to directly manage risks to these digital collections and ensure that future demands, whether for increased capacity or for new types of scholarly access, can be met. Just as we've always been in libraries at the forefront of preserving print materials for centuries, research libraries and the UTL are now playing a leadership role in creating infrastructure for preservation and accessibility to the digital record. I want to quickly talk about digital scholarship. Digitization allows new research questions to be asked and answered using the content that we've digitized. And what we're looking for is ways we can help scholars ask new questions. There's feedback. You hear the feedback?
Mostly it's okay.
Okay, all right. All right. Our digital scholarship librarians are working with scholars to create and steward and use digital scholarly research content. This work includes collaborating with partners to build digital collections, to build interoperable modular tools for digital scholarship, and most recently, work has begun to prototype text and data mining tools that can be used with the digital collections that we're amassing. We're finding ways in libraries to bring all this data together easily so that scholars around the world can use the data housed in our libraries in seamless ways to build new knowledge through digital scholarship, through the reuse of research data, and through the replication of research findings. We're currently in the middle of a major digital scholarship initiative funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation to develop digital tools to support manuscript study. Medieval manuscript study. These tools will allow medieval scholars from around the world to work collaboratively in real time on manuscripts instead of traveling to repositories around the world to work one manuscript and one scholar at a time. So imagine looking across the hundreds of books of hours housed in monasteries and libraries around the world, around Europe and North America at least, to see the annotations of different scribes or the same scribe in different copies. Imagine being able to learn the original order of the Canterbury Tales, which is critical to understanding Chaucer, by unraveling digitally the bindings of some of the rarest Chaucer manuscripts. Imagine doing that in real time with other scholars around the world, all working together, sharing that work and collaborating across time zones using technologies and digital images. That is the exciting frontier of knowledge and research called digital scholarship, and that libraries are enabling by joining the digitized artifact with new technology-based tools. So this project is being done with other leading libraries around the world, and we think it will be transformative for medieval scholarship, but we also expect and hope that it can be transferred to other disciplines. So you could equally well imagine this tool supporting comparison of medical images from several health centers. A couple of other examples of some of this research. One of our librarians and a faculty member here just got a grant from SHARC, an insight grant from SHARC to study web networks of Islamophobia in Europe, in Eastern Europe. They'll be using web archive data harvested by the libraries, including the U of T libraries, to analyze patterns of interaction between hate groups across Europe. This type of scholarship is possible now because of the pioneering work of libraries and librarians to facilitate access to the ever-expanding body of knowledge through collection preservation and the creation of cutting-edge technological tools. For us, it means going back to building collections, so harvesting what in some cases are unsavory websites to support current and future research. As an aside, I'd say, based on the conversation this morning, some of our librarians also, just before the appointment of the new U.S. Environmental Protection Agency head, harvested a lot of data off of the EPA website because of the fears it would be taken down. It actually has been taken down, and so that data is now preserved in U.S. libraries and Canadian libraries, including at the U of T. So let me just quickly turn, because I'm running out of time, to the fifth priority, teaching information skills in the digital age. Fake news is much discussed. We've talked about it a lot this morning, and our libraries are working on ways to help students and others know the fake from the real. It is difficult, actually, as we heard this morning. It is not always easy to know. But the library has a role in teaching digital information skills, or it has been doing that for a century, and the world of information has become so much more complex just in the last decade, and there's so much more information that it's even more critical. Fake news has always existed, as we heard this morning, but today it gets propagated so rapidly that it's harder to figure out what is real. Students are often tech savvy, but not information savvy, and we want to ensure that when they leave the university, they're both tech savvy and information savvy. Fake news is a political and a social issue, but it's also an information skills issue that we believe that we can help with. But digital literacy goes well beyond fake news. We also have to make certain our students know how to go beyond a Google search to the research record, which is often dark, as I said earlier, if they're to be successful. So they have to learn to understand how to evaluate the research record, what peer review is, why it is so important, among other skills, to be information literate. Librarians have a vital role in ensuring, in fact, that our students are wise and savvy users of information when they graduate. And I'm very proud of, well, as Steve said, actually identifying and even defining fake news can be hard, but I'm very proud that some of our librarians are at the leading edge of teaching students and others how to assess the quality of information, whether political or social, and to understand how to assess the research record. So here are two of our librarians on the front page of the Toronto Metro discussing how to identify fake news. This has got a lot of play in the news media, and they're working to ensure that students graduate really ready to critically engage with the complex information landscape. So all of these priorities and all else we do focuses on our users, present and future. It is always in the end in libraries, and this is a principle of centuries, it's about the users. It must be, if libraries are to remain strong and relevant institutions within the academy and within society, and do their job, which is to acquire, preserve, and make accessible for close study, but also for macro-analysis and digital scholarship, the record of human knowledge and achievement. I put this slide up because it marks the 125th anniversary of the opening of the first modern library at the University of Toronto, now called the Gerstein Library. This is the original reading room that was restored some years ago. It's a wonderful example of how the past informs the present and the ways that libraries have continued to evolve to meet the needs of our users now and then. I just wanted to, that was actually the end, but I wanted to, before I stopped, to put in a plug for the Fisher Library's most recent exhibit. It went up about 2 weeks ago. It's called Struggle and Story. It's an exhibit that actually that presents the documentary history of Canada over the last 200 years, but certainly around Confederation and this 150th year of Confederation. I think it's well worth seeing. It'll be up through September. It has an extraordinary exhibit catalog as well as an extraordinary exhibit. So I hope if you have a chance, you'll come by the Fisher Library and see that exhibit. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm curious, if a brand new university were being established and you were hired as the chief librarian, would you tell them that they could dispense with a bricks and mortar building? And if not today, is there a time coming when a new university would be able to dispense with a book-oriented facility?
So those may be two different questions. So book-oriented, probably yes, for a new university. Although I think there is still a place for books. There actually are more books, people don't realize this, there are more books published now than have ever been published before. So publishing of books actually continues to thrive. Sales maybe not so much, but the publishing continues to thrive. And actually book sales are going up. There's some, I can't remember the exact data, but I read something recently that in fact even among young people there is a sort of rising trend in actually preferring books over e-readers. And the sort of the sales of e-books on e-readers has actually plateaued somewhat. But that doesn't mean that that most of the research record isn't digital, and you know that's critical. However, the Library of Place, so leaving aside libraries as a place that stored books, the library as a place that is a place for collaboration, for interdisciplinary work. As I said, Robarts Library has 18,000 people coming into it on a heavy day. It is often occupied by as many as 4,000 people. Students can't find a place to sit. So they're not always using collections. They're often working with each other. They're using the other tools, the visualization stuff we provide, the data, the computers. They're using all of that. And I think, and that is also true of public libraries, which continue to be heavily used in this and every other city. So I actually don't think that there will, at least in the foreseeable future, a time when all of that will disappear and the need for that would disappear. But I do think it would be a different kind of building from Robarts Library or Gerstein Library, frankly.
When you build your new buildings, in order to avoid the fate of the library at Alexandria, you hire engineers. We just heard from Dave Parnas that there are basically no computer engineers, yet you're building enormous libraries, virtual libraries, and putting books, virtual books in them. How are you coping without the computer engineers? How are you making sure that you don't have things internally that are going to burst into flames, virtually flames?
So we do rely on software engineers, I will confess. We have, as I said, we have a data center with some 500 servers, many of them virtualized, 1.5 petabytes of data. We have experts in data preservation, including how do you migrate data, reformat it, look for issues like bit drop and bit rot to ensure that 10, 15, 20 years from now, the data is still as good as it is right now. And when I say data, I'm actually in many cases talking about the text material, but also research data that we may preserve. We have lots of programmers who are working on things like Project Canopus that I mentioned, which is a data ingestion and preservation tool. So despite what he said, I'm concerned about what he said, but in fact we are relying on software engineering, software development projects to make sure that that material actually is still here a century from now. And I actually do think it's a concern. There's no, we just bought the Roman de la Rose, published in, not published, but a manuscript that was written in 1390. It's in exquisite shape. It's not clear, actually, that the record of contemporary times, so the research record that's digital, but also the Twitter feeds and the websites, that any of that will still exist. And I think it is a concern whether our descendants will actually understand our times, whether they will actually have the record that exists for the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, whether it will still exist. But I think that's also the goal of almost every research library in the world, is to ensure that it does get preserved. One of the ways of doing that is something called lots of copies make stuff safe. So we don't have the only copy of any of these digital records. They are actually spread across. There's lots of cooperative activities in North America and Europe to ensure multiple copies so that hopefully one of those copies will still be here 100 or 200 years from now.
Talking about preservation, one of the things that worries a lot of us is that the federal government no longer puts out its reports in print form. It used to be anything they said had an ISBN number and it was deposited. Now it's on a website and then it disappears. And that is very, very complicated for democracy, because you can't hold government responsible towards things that they've said 2 years ago and that then they don't do any longer, or they do the opposite. So I wonder what you're doing about that aspect.
So that's a hard question too. So there are a number of librarians across Canada. Some of our librarians are participating, but many others as well. So it really is a sort of community effort. And it actually started when the federal government was building its sort of one-stop shopping website. And I actually, I'm sort of not a conspiracy theorist. I don't actually believe that it was intended just to take stuff down and hide information. I think it was to make things more efficient. But an unintended consequence was actually a lot of information was going away. So a number of librarians began almost a sort of guerrilla tactic to capture as much of that material as possible. And we have a lot of it at the University of Toronto. Others have it. I mentioned the Environmental Protection Agency in the US. There was actually pretty strong statements from the incoming director of the EPA that much of the climate data was going to be taken down. And so that was actually proactive to try to make sure that data was preserved. And again, it was both US and Canadian libraries. So in many cases, we have the data. We have all the Twitter, well, not all, but much of the Twitter and social media stuff from, say, the mayoral campaign in Toronto in 2014. The issue is actually how do we make it discoverable and accessible? So we preserved it. It may be dark because there are lots of issues. There's just the technology to make it accessible and discoverable, but there's also copyright issues that we have to deal with. But we thought, our librarians thought, that the most important thing was to get it on a server, protect it, keep it, and then we can figure out later how to actually make it accessible. But that doesn't mean that it's all going to be saved. It is a hard thing to do. I'd also put in a plug for the Library and Archives of Canada. In the last 3 years, under its new director, Guy Bertillon, they are actually also working very hard to protect a lot of the federal information and to make sure that it is archived and preserved. He's an archivist and a historian by training, and he sees that as a very important responsibility and priority of Library and Archives of Canada.
Peter, right here, has a question.
A quick one. It's somewhat related to the previous question, but at a different angle. Larry, you outlined very ably the terrific resources that our library system has, both material and human and intellectual. But in this interconnected world, no library, no matter how strong and how large, can do it alone. You referred very briefly to collective approaches. And I wonder if you could say a few more words about collaborative approaches, such as, for instance, digital preservation, other types of collaboration, and say something about the politics and the mechanics of that kind of collaboration.
So to take the latter part first, the politics and mechanics are collaboration has to be a win-win. And as the largest library in Canada, sometimes it can be a little hard to see what the win is, but I think collaboration is important and we do win. So I'll just give a couple of examples, some of which you know about, Peter, but we work very closely with the other 20 universities in Ontario to operate something called Scholars Portal. So we pay about 20% of the cost, but they cover the other 80%. We provide a lot of the in-kind costs like space and utilities and stuff. But it enables all of us, I think, to have much better developed discovery tools and digital preservation tools than the U of T could ever do on its own, and certainly that the smallest institutions could ever do at all. So that is sort of the power of cooperation. But I'll give a couple of examples as well in sort of collections. So we have and some of you may have heard this before, but we have an arrangement with Columbia University, who has just an extraordinary Tibetan studies bibliographer, librarian. So we actually pay a part of her salary, and she is also our Tibetan studies bibliographer. There's material in Tibetan Buddhism studies that you can only get by going to places like Chengdu in China and actually buying it in little bookshops. And she actually makes a buying trip on behalf of Columbia and us once a year. She buys material for both institutions, but she actually doesn't duplicate. So the collections are almost completely complementary, which means we're building in North America a really great collection that we couldn't otherwise do without that collaboration. More locally, we have partnered with with four other institutions in Ontario, so MAC, Western, Ottawa, and Queens, at Downsview in our storage facility to create a print preservation facility. So we will all jointly basically cover the cost of preserving print materials, one copy of important research material that needs to be preserved for literally centuries, but where we probably don't need 5 or 10 copies. So we're doing that jointly with our 5 institutions at Downsview, but we're also then connecting that to other such repositories print preservation repositories across North America, so in both Canada and the United States. So there might be 20 copies of such books preserved, which mathematically we are told would ensure that at least 3 or 4 copies will still be extant 200 years from now. So, and there are lots of other ways that we're cooperating across North America.
I want to ask you a question in regards to the dissemination of the information that you have. Arnold Schwartz down in New York, he was at MIT or something like that, and I mean, what is the access for the public to have the information? I know that among the scholars they can get it, but if I was to go into your website, do I have full access?
So I alluded to that, and that is a serious issue. So, and what happened? He was. I actually had met him. He was a wonderful young man who was deeply committed to the idea of open access to information around the world. The issue is, and so the answer is actually no. If you're not affiliated, depends on your affiliation, but people who are not affiliated with the University of Toronto or other major universities often don't have access to the research record, which is funded by taxpayers in the United States and Canada and Europe. It is, I believe, not sure what the word is. It is not supportable that taxpayers can't get access to information. So you have a child who has, and this is a real story, who has type 1 diabetes that's just diagnosed, and you're not in a university unless you walk into one of our libraries, and if you walk in, you can get access. But unless you can do that, you can't get access to the latest taxpayer-funded research on type 1 diabetes. That is just plain wrong. But it is because major companies across the world, for-profit companies, basically own that information, and we license it for our scholars, but we can't license it for the public. We actually spend a lot of money licensing it. So as I said, $22 million a year, $4.3 million for just one major publisher. But those licenses only cover U of T affiliated people. It's wrong, and it's something that lots of librarians are talking about around the world. How do we break that cycle of taxpayers fund research, universities and university faculty do the research and pay for support it, and then it goes to these publishers and they control the access to it. It sounds like a no-brainer, you just fix it, but in fact, it is really difficult to fix.